Hey guys, it's Sarah Norris
And Carrie Eink
from the Star Institute for SPD, and we are going to be talking about relationships today, and specifically how important it is to be considering all the relationships that impact our clients and the individuals we work with.
Yeah, so at Star, we use a relationship-based model with all of our clients. So even with our kids, we are using a relationship-based model. Our parents are in all our treatment sessions. We put in parent educations into all their programs because this is what we found is the most effective way that we can really treat the family and kind of make those changes that last throughout the lifespan. So we use play theories, we use cognitive theories, SI theories, all that kind of go into this relationship-based model. So in starting to develop our adolescent and adult program, we knew that we wanted to keep this model the same. And so we use a really heavy relationship-based model with our teens and adults as well.
So really, I think the two big things that we're looking at when we're working with an individual is the individual differences. And that's just basically how someone processes sensations and how they interact with others and kind of some of those personality traits. And then also how those relationships in their lives are either supporting them or could be tweaked to support them a little bit more.
Yeah, so once we move into adolescence and adulthood, our relationships, some of our relationships are similar to when we're kids. We have our relationships with our parents, our relationships with our siblings. We have relationships with friends, and as we know, those can kind of evolve throughout the lifespan. But what can also happen is you develop romantic relationships as well. And so that's another relationship that isn't so common that we wouldn't be working on in the pediatric world that we start to work on with adolescents and adults.
And then I think the other one that becomes pretty complex is when we're working with a parent, and especially if their child also needs intervention or is getting intervention. There's a lot of that kind of, we have to look from both angles, or if it's two parents, all of the angles. And if there's multiple children, it just adds exponentially the number of relationships we're working with.
Yeah, so we all know that relationships in general, they can be challenging because they are so complex, they are so multifaceted. Us as OTs, how we can incorporate relationships into our treatment is by really first helping the individual understand themselves, and then kind of transferring into the realm of how can they advocate for themselves, how can I help them advocate for themselves, how can they start having these two-way conversations about what they want, what they need from a sensory perspective.
And I think one of the things that we're always striving for is taking everybody's needs into consideration. So we may have a designated client that we're working with, but we're also thinking about what are the other individual differences in relationship needs for the people that they have close relationships with. So it does make us step back quite a bit and think about a lot of times more of the long-term implications of these relationships. A lot of times when we're starting with children, there's a lot of the process of helping parents come to grips with the fact that this is not usually a quick fix. It's something that is going to be part of their lives with their child for a long time. And it is more of that, how do we move through adolescence and into adulthood and make those shifts and responsibilities over time? So really thinking about what are some of the core things that we find are really important throughout the lifespan.
Yeah, we've gotten some really good comments on some of the videos in the past weeks, pretty much talking about that relationship piece and what do you do if it seems like somebody's constantly needing all these accommodations for themselves and it might be getting in the way of relationships? And I think that's a really great question, and that's really something we need to be thinking about from both the individual as well as the people around them. And I know we've talked about this in some of our other videos, we've alluded to it, especially around the holidays, but it's kind of finding that balance between advocating for what you need, listening to what others need, just as in any relationship. But what we know, if you're an individual with SPD, that self-understanding doesn't always come as naturally. So even understanding where your body is in space can be difficult. So understanding your emotions, understanding somebody else's emotions can become really challenging. And so what I'm learning from my clients is that these conversations become really difficult, even beginning with properly identifying what made you feel a way or what it even is that you're feeling.
So I think what I want to start with is kind of outline what are some general strategies that we coach individuals to use. And a lot of times we're coaching the parents on how to support their child, or as they get older, it could be how a spouse can support their spouse or partner, etc. But some of the big things that we talk about here are validation and holding space. So what that means is when an individual is having a challenge and experiencing an intense emotion, that validation is really that active listening of, maybe you're telling them, I am hearing what you're saying, or I'm seeing what your body is telling me, and I know you're having a hard time, and I know that this is difficult. And instead of trying to step in and fix the problem or make the emotion go away, it's that sitting with that person and whatever they're feeling and just kind of walking with them through an emotional response, and not trying to shorten it, hurry it up, really not trying to influence it at all, just letting it happen naturally. And so one of the analogies that I really like is talking about how emotions are like waves. And the way that we can help individuals process emotions is to let them ride the wave out and not try and stop the wave, not try and freeze the wave, not try and ignore the wave, but really just let it happen. And it's easier to do with positive emotions. We want to join that emotion. We want to be with people when they're happy and celebrating and really enjoying themselves. But it's so important to do that for those more negative emotions like anger and sadness, guilt, shame, etc.
Yeah, one of the things I hear a lot with some of the older teens and adults that I work with is that this validation piece, especially if they got diagnosed later in life, this validation piece has been something that has been missing pretty largely throughout their childhood and adolescent years. They're used to hearing that they just need to get over it, they just need to push through it, they just need to, etc., things along those lines. And I think that this validation piece becomes a lot easier for spouses and families and parents when they understand and when they're educated on what it is, on the individual differences of their family member, of their spouse, their significant other. And so that's, even with pediatrics, even with young kids, that's the place we always start as occupational therapists. We want to educate everybody, including the individual, on what their individual differences are. So starting out with saying, well, maybe touch is hard for him because he's over-responsive to touch. This is what over-responsive means from a neurological perspective. He's going into fight or flight several times a day, and when we go into fight or flight, we lose our control of our emotions and our behavior, and so what he's saying and doing aren't actually in his control, and he's not meaning to do that. And so really taking that shift and going back to the physiology and anatomy really helps families say, oh, maybe he really can't help it. Maybe it really is a difference from me and how my body is processing sensations. And it's kind of that light bulb moment and that authentic shift into true validation and true understanding. Of course, there's always going to be individual differences of others that we can't fully understand because it is so different than ourselves, but continuing to educate yourself on each other can really be an important first step.
And I think one of the things that I've learned through experience and over time with the validation piece is it's usually not helpful to tell a person how they're feeling or how they're making you feel in that validation stage. It's more just taking the time to stop and recognize that something's happening. And so, for example, oftentimes we have kids that have a hard time leaving the gym. And so I found it's a lot more effective to say something like, this is hard, and you're not ready, and things like that. Talking about, oof, you're having a big feeling, but not saying, you're disappointed, you're angry, you're mad, you're sad. Because one of the things that I've learned about individuals with sensory processing challenges is a lot of times the feeling words don't fit. They're not exactly just one emotion, and it can be really confusing, especially at early ages, to try and narrow it down to one feeling word.
Yeah, when I started working with adults. I remember one of my first clients, one of the first things she told me was how misidentified her emotions had been her whole life. Her whole life, people thought they would always ask her, why are you sad all the time? Why are you always bored? And it's just comes from that affect and the way her body was presenting to the world that she didn't even really have an understanding of, that was telling everybody that she looked sad or she looked bored. And she said, really, a lot of these times I'm really happy or I'm very content. And just thinking about the invalidation that can bring of misidentifying somebody's emotions. I really like that point that you made about not just jumping to labeling anybody's feelings. Even, I mean, this has transferred over into me being a very different therapist with the kids that I work with and asking a lot of questions around their emotions. Like, are you feeling disappointed? I'm not sure. I'm seeing this from your body, and letting them tell us. And of course, with kids, that is a lot more simple sometimes than when we get into adulthood, but kind of thinking about that throughout the lifespan, I think, can be really important for us as caregivers as well as us as occupational therapists.
One other thing that I've learned in that validation phase is a lot of individuals can't pinpoint things right away, and they also can't settle right away. They have a hard time identifying what they're experiencing in the moment, and they actually have to wait for the emotion to pass to be able to identify what caused it, why it's happening. So it's when someone's upset, of course you want to know what you can do to help. So you're like, what's wrong? What's going on? What happened? And for these individuals, that can just add anxiety because they don't know. And one of the things that can be challenging is figuring out, well, okay, how do I sit with them in this? Or how do I give them the space to feel what they're feeling? And oftentimes it's just an understanding silence is what they need. Some people really need their own space to do that, so they may find a way to get away from others, go for a walk or take a break so that they can recover, and then they might be ready to talk. Others find it really, really helpful to have someone safe nearby that they know will be there when they are ready to talk. So it does take some time to figure out what your loved one will need, or even what you yourself need in those moments, but it's very common for individuals that we work with to not be able to pinpoint the cause of their emotions in the moment.
Yeah, and I think this is where working with an occupational therapist can be so helpful in identifying some of those things, learning how to talk. I mean, I know that Sarah and I have both, in some of our adult and adolescent treatment, we've kind of worked as a sensory mediator, for lack of better words, within our sessions. Sometimes I even get out that zones of regulation visual that we've shown in previous videos, and talking about the concepts of what two people in the blue zone, that low arousal, what that would look like in a conversation, what two people in that green zone, that just right regulation, that's kind of the ideal place to be for a majority of the conversation. As we all know, conversations can easily get up into that yellow zone, and I think that that's pretty natural and pretty typical, but it's once it starts verging towards that red zone and that fight or flight, which we know even talking about big emotions can get any of us into that really high arousal place. And what we've talked about before on these videos is once we get into that red zone, that really high arousal, we lose our capacities. And so what people end up saying and doing ends up being a little bit out of their control, and they end up saying and doing things that they really don't mean, that really don't have any merit behind them. And so even kind of holding that visual, I've literally kind of stood in a room and had the visual and showing them where they were at. And then if we start getting near that upper yellow zone, we've gotten on the trampoline, everybody jumps it out, maybe one of them gets on a swing, the other person needs to go, get a drink of water, and just starting to learn those skills can be really helpful for once you go home. But it might be that you might need a mental health worker, a psychologist, an occupational therapist, just to be in the room to kind of help keep that regulation as you're talking about these big subjects that can be big from a sensory perspective and big from an emotional standpoint.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to point out that you're not recommending that when you're in an interaction with a loved one that you have that zones of regulation while you're talking to them, because that can be pretty triggering, and it does come back to that you're labeling me and you don't know what I'm feeling. So I like how you're saying having someone outside, kind of that third party that can help with that. Okay, I'm here to just kind of help you guys have this safe space for both of you. And when someone is not keeping it safe anymore, that's when I'll signal that we need to take a break.
Yeah, and that's another reason I like to use the zones visual, is because it's just putting it at colors. It's not pinpointing the exact emotion, and I think that that's one way it can be really helpful, is because within conversations, it's really hard for us to identify, as well as the individual themselves to identify. So I think it's another way that it can be really helpful.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of recap and visit just something that I found really helpful for myself. There's a book out there called I Don't Have to Make It All Better, I think, and they just talk about how the process of validation is listen, 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 understand. And that teaching other people about what they should do or what they could do needs to come at a time that there's no emotional uproar happening. So when someone's feeling something emotional, and this is something that I think of examples with teenagers all the time, it's just an emotional period of life. And I think if you as a parent, or even a boyfriend, girlfriend for a teenager, what teenagers really need is just someone to listen. And so I don't think there's a parent out there that hasn't heard, you don't understand, you're not listening to me. And it's really coming from that place of feeling invalidated. And a lot of teenagers just need that space for someone to listen to them and to keep listening to them and to maybe ask a couple questions just for the purpose of understanding. And I think it's something that's really hard to do when you care deeply about another person, because of course you don't want them to struggle and you don't want them to suffer and you do want to make it all better. But it's actually counterproductive to try and go down that road when someone's emotional.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And kind of another bridge from that. So this coming Monday, we are having another roundtable discussion on our education platform, and this is for paid members, but this week we're doing it for individuals with SPD. And what we want to do is just start the conversation. We want to hear from you. We want to listen to you. We want to hear more from you guys about your questions, maybe your shared experiences, your different experiences. And so that will be happening Monday at 11 a.m. Colorado time.
And I think it's important to know that this is something, we want to talk to individuals with SPD, but also talking to parents and teenagers and spouses and things like that. When you have you want a better understanding and you want to know what you can do for a teen or an adult with SPD, that's the focus of this one. So there will be opportunities for parents of children to kind of have this discussion, but this one's going to be focused on teens and adults. So we would really love to get some back and forth. We had the opportunity to do it with professionals earlier this week, and it was just so wonderful to have an actual conversation instead of just kind of talking to Facebook.
Yeah, and it's a Zoom conversation, and so it's sitting at your own computer with a webcam, or even if you just have a microphone that you can talk into. And it was really cool hearing from professionals all across the world and kind of comparing and contrasting what you guys are doing in adult treatment and adolescent treatment. And so I think that would be really cool from the adult adolescent perspectives as well. So let us know if you have any questions about that. We'll post the link, or we'll post some more information about the roundtable below, so you guys can check that out.
So thanks guys so much.